federal environmental assessment process started as a voluntary, non-binding process. Initially in the late 70s, early 80s. It then became formalized under the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act in 1992. That process, or that act, has since been amended a number of times, most notably in 2003. It was strengthened in a number of ways, and then in 2010 and 2012, it was significantly weakened. The scope was narrowed. It now applies to much fewer activities and projects. So we've gone over the period of the last 25 years from doing up to 1,000 assessments a year to now doing maybe 25 or 30 a year. And we've gone in terms of the scope from looking at all environmental impacts to looking at very few. So we're now focused on impacts on fish, on endangered species, on aquatic species, on migratory birds, and impacts on Indigenous communities. So I first got involved in the federal environmental assessment process after I completed my master's at Osgoode Hall Law School. I had done my master's actually on a topic completely unrelated to environmental assessment and just had the opportunity to work for Environment Canada on the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act. During the development of the Act, I saw it through the House of Commons and the Senate and worked on some of the regulations. So that really piqued my interest in environmental assessment, and I kind of saw the promise of it being a tool for sustainability, of making good decisions before we approve projects. So I saw the potential and then followed it as a practicing lawyer, working for interveners and proponents in environmental assessment processes. Over the last 5 years, two colleagues of mine and I have been working on the next generation environmental assessment through a SSHRC-funded project. And as it happened, we completed our work a year before the last federal election, and the new government came in and announced that it would reform the federal environmental assessment process because it had recognized that it had lost credibility, it had lost what they could say was social license. Since the announcement, I've been working hard with my colleagues, engaging with this federal process, first through the expert review panel that was set up to seek input into how to reform the Act, and now more directly with government and with other stakeholders to try to move the federal environmental assessment forward. One of the limitations of the federal environmental assessment process, and frankly most environmental assessment processes, is that it has become very difficult to start them early enough. And so often assessment processes get started once the proponent has done all its homework, has a detailed design of the proposed activity, has done a lot of the environmental assessment already for its own purposes, and then that design and that assessment gets tested by governments and by the public. Of course, the difficulty with that is that the proponent is then very heavily invested in a particular way of implementing the proposed activity, and it's very difficult to convince the proponent to take a change direction at that point. So one of the key elements of next generation environmental assessment has to be that the process starts when the proponent starts thinking seriously about the proposed activity and how they want to design it. And so the ideal process is one where project design by the proponent happens in parallel with government thinking about how to regulate and with public engagement. I think the proposed Energy East pipeline is actually a good example of why this matters. So we have a project that will cost billions of dollars. The pipeline will cross most of this country, so thousands of kilometers. Will go through many hundreds of communities, affect First Nations communities and their rights and title, but also it has implications for our economic future. It kind of ties us to a fossil fuel-based future, and so there are all kinds of interesting questions about whether investing billions of dollars in fossil fuel infrastructure at a time where we're trying to transition away from fossil fuels towards a more renewable, climate-friendly future with all the economic opportunities that are associated with that, renewable energy, transition to electrification of vehicles and buildings, and so on. So we're at a critical point, and the environmental assessment process, if it works, has the potential to resolve those issues and to provide a forum for discussion so that we hopefully will come out of that discussion with a kind of common vision about our future and the sustainability of this country.